Good evening, everybody, and welcome. I'm Brandon Ruud, Abert Family Curator of American Art here at the Milwaukee Art Museum and co-curator of the exhibition Americans in Spain, Painting and Travel, 1820 to 1920. For the purposes of this evening, as we speak, we will unmask ourselves, but then put them back on as we move through the galleries. I am so excited to have you join us tonight because we have a very special program, one that is live here in the galleries, and so with it, the experimentation and spontaneity that goes with it. And before we begin the program, I do have a long list of thank yous. As you can imagine, an exhibition like this takes a whole great team of people, and I am especially thankful for the crew here at the museum for all their help and assistance in putting it together. And I want to give a special thanks to the people behind the scenes, China Bounds and Ted Rusabardis. I especially want to thank our exhibition sponsors. The national presenting sponsor is the Henry Luce Foundation, with a major grant for overall presentation from the National Endowment from the Humanities. Our supporting sponsors are the Wyeth Foundation for American Art, the Milwaukee Art Museum's American Art Society, and the Tourist Office of Spain in Chicago. Our contributing supporters and sponsors include Christie's and the Gladys Kriebel Delmas Foundation. And I'm especially grateful to the American Art Society for their support of tonight's program, as well as all educational programming for the exhibition. And I do hope that you will join us for our next conversation in this series on Thursday, July 26th, with scholar Eugenia Efiniganova.
August 26th.
Did I say July?
You did.
Okay. Well, we're going to travel back in time. Speaking of travel, on August 26th, there's the spontaneity. Thank you. But I'm especially excited tonight because I am being joined by two scholars with great expertise and insights into the many of the works that they're going to discuss and you're going to see this evening. Richard Kagan, here on my left, is Academy Professor and Arthur O. Lovejoy Professor Emeritus of History at Johns Hopkins University, and his research focuses on the writing of both chronicles and history in early modern Spain and colonial Spanish America. He is the author of numerous books on the subject, most notably and recently for our purposes, The Spanish Craze, America's Fascination with the Hispanic World, 1779 to 1939. And we are being joined on my right by Marianna Shreve Simpson. And Shreve is a scholar at the University of Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, and has published, taught, and lectured widely on early modern Islamic art. Perhaps most importantly for us this evening, from 1995 to 2000, she was Director of Curatorial Affairs and Curator of Islamic Art at the Walters Art Museum, which has 3 paintings on loan to the exhibition. So of course she has special knowledge and insights into that, which she'll be sharing. And Simpson has also published widely on Persian manuscripts and on 19th century American artist Edwin Lord Weeks, most recently with the essay Edwin Lord Weeks, an American artist in Andalusia. So with that, please join me in giving an actual or virtual welcome to Richard Kagan and Shreve Simpson. And with that, Richard, please take it away.
All right, can I take my mask off? And thank you so much, Brandon, for that lovely introduction. And it's a pleasure for me to be here and to see this wonderful exhibition. But let's begin, I think, with the gentleman who was in many ways the inspiration for many of the artists, many of the paintings in the exhibition and the ones that we'll see later on. So if we could walk over here, if you can follow me. Should I turn my back? I don't feel like I should. And what the painting we're looking at here is by a Scottish painter by the name of David Wilkes, who was a great friend of the gentleman you see depicted here. This is Washington Irving, the famous American Romantic writer. And Wilkie depicted it, Washington Irving, in a library in Seville, where Irving was checking his footnotes for his famous biography of the life of Columbus, which was published in 1829. But while he was in Seville, where he's working here, Irving became fascinated. In fact, fell in love with southern Spain, Seville in particularly. And he took a journey from Seville eastwards to Granada. And in the course of that journey, he said, look at these people here. They have the Arab look, the Arabian look. They have some Oriental passion within them. This is a land of fantasy, a land of imagination, a land where the Moors who once occupied, the Muslims who once occupied southern Spain are still alive in the hearts and the minds of the people. And he stopped in a little inn en route from Seville to Granada. And in the courtyard of the inn, there was a kind of a spontaneous flamenco dance. He said, this is a scene set for a painter. It is picturesque, it's imaginative, it's a spirit I want to capture. And then he went on to Granada, where to visit the famous Muslim monument known as the Red Fort or Alhambra. And it was there that he began to imagine himself back in Moorish times, back in the Middle Ages, in a series of short stories or arabesques that he wove together into his famous book, The Tales of the Alhambra, that was published 4 years later, in 1832. And in those arabesques, he painted an imaginary picture of Muslim Spain with lovelorn princesses walking through the Alhambra, turbaned princes coming back from fights against Christians and the like. In a sense, he created this imaginary world. He transported himself and his readers into this imagined, romanticized vision of Spain. And that romanticized, imaginary Spain, populated with dashing peasants and brigands and the like, is that image that captivated many of the artists who you'll see in the exhibition today. In a sense, he was an inspiration for them all. They all essentially traveled in Spain with Tales of the Alhambra in their briefcase, under their arm, and we'll see the results of that in a few minutes. Now, if you follow me, and I'll put my mask back on like a good boy. Where's Shreve?
Shreve is waiting for us.
Oh.
Right over here.
So as Richard has explained, Washington Irving created the Tales of the Alhambra. He created the image of a romanticized, mythical Moorish past for Andalusia. But it fell to many artists, including John Ferguson Weir, an American of the late 19th century. It fell to those artists to basically create the pictures, the visual pictures, the artistic pictures of these wonderful monuments in southern Spain. And especially the Alhambra, the name comes from the Arabic, meaning the red fort, the color red being that of the terrain around in Granada, the soil in Granada. And the Alhambra was probably a small fort on one of the spurs built originally in the 8th or 9th century on one of the spurs of the Sierra Nevada mountains, which you see behind in this wonderful painting. But really the form that Weir has shown us is that from the 14th century. But it sometimes today known as the Palace of the Alhambra, and when you visit southern Spain, that's what you'll sign up for, a visit to the Alhambra Palace. But actually it's a fortified town or a fortress. So it's a whole series of towers and courtyards. But from the outside, it has this very austere, majestic appearance, very sort of sober. And I think Weir has captured that really wonderfully with this view from the western part of the valley, of the Douro Valley that separates the town of Granada from the fortress of the Alhambra. He's shown us a number of the towers of the Alhambra, but he hasn't necessarily followed the exact placement of the towers. He's placed them in a way that made, for him, kind of compositional sense. And this is typical of the way that many American and European artists of the late 19th and early 20th century reacted to and depicted and represented the monuments and places of Andalusia, of southern Spain. That is to say, they wanted to create the way Washington Irving created a special image in prose. These artists created their own special composite fictive images in paint. And their images are the ones that stick in all of our minds. And I think this exhibition is wonderful, both testament to the artist's ability to capture the imagery and images and imagination that Irving evoked. And it's also a wonderful tribute to the Milwaukee Art Museum and the Chrysler in Norfolk, Virginia, for making all the necessary effort to bring these paintings and other works of art together to help us all understand what the image of Spain was and to a certain extent still is today. So I think we move on now to, yes, Rhonda.
Thank you, Shreve. If Weir was interested in painting this, monumentalizing Irving's vision of southern Spain, Childe Hassam, another American painter of the late 19th, early 20th century, wanted to capture the more intimate aspects of what Irving had called a scene set for a painter. That is to say, the picturesque. And the town, this was then almost a village, he represented here is Ronda, which sits alongside a very deep gorge and has a wonderful bridge in it. And it's one of these quintessential towns of southern Spain that the artists in this exhibition wanted to depict. And they always sensed that they were very much interested in the kind of the street scenes and the traditional costumes of both men and women. In a sense, they were evoking a kind of a quiet, calm Spain, a Spain that was, to a certain degree, disappearing at the time that Childe Hassam was in Spain. It was industrializing and connecting itself to the wider world. But these painters were interested in capturing almost this, what we could call sunny Spain. It was that Spain that Washington Irving had evoked in Tales of the Alhambra, changing an image of kind of a negative image of Spain, the quintessential Protestant black legend of Spain, which was cruel, ruled by corrupt absolute monarchs, ruined by legions of priests and monks who kept the people in ignorance and dominated by malevolent inquisitors. Irving changed that from dark to light. It was sunny, it was dancing, it was filled with romanticized types of these, such as the women you see depicted in this plaza in Ronda, which is in the sense a town that attracted American painters from that day to this. It's the place that you still want to go to if you visit Andalusia. And it's interesting, one more point. For Irving and for many of these other painters, Spain was Andalusia, that is to say, southern Spain. Forget Barcelona in the northeast. Forget Bilbao in the Basque Country in the north, or even Santiago in the northwest. That was rainy. It was more industrialized. It was more modern. They wanted to capture these quaint, picturesque, ancient, almost ancient aspects of Spain because it represented a lost world, a world that America in the course of the 19th century, with all of its industrialization and all of its urbanization, was leaving behind. They saw a spirit there, a sense of vitality there that they thought was absent in their own country. In a sense, was that spirit was the magnet that drew not only painters, but also tourists to Spain, American tourists to Spain in growing numbers. I think we can move on to.
So the exhibition, this wonderful exhibition, Americans in Spain, actually includes many works of art by Spanish artists who were influenced, who influenced the Americans who came to visit and eventually paint and depict the monuments of southern Spain. And one of the Spanish artists who is most influential in that respect is Marianna Fortuney, the artist who did this painting belonging to the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore. Fortuney was actually Catalan of origin, meaning he came from the region around Barcelona, but spent time in the southern part of Spain, but was commissioned by the Catalan government in Barcelona to do a series of paintings of North African scenes. And this is one of those paintings, which depicts, again, the way Irving created a mythical view of southern Spain. Marianna Fortuney created a kind of mythical fantasized view of North African culture and North African people. So this is called Arab Fantasia, this painting, and it does in fact depict a ritual or kind of an exercise that took place in various parts of North Africa at times of high celebration, celebrating a military victory, for instance, celebrating a wedding, celebrating, I don't know, an anniversary or whatever, some celebratory occasion when the residents of the male residents, I should say, of various parts of North Africa would grab their guns and engage in a kind of ritual of firing off the guns. And usually they did it on horseback. Fortuny has depicted it here as if it was a dance, so on foot. But what he's clearly managed to capture is the verve and dynamism of the occasion. But at the same time, he's created a kind of fantasy picture of not of a specific event, but a kind of a cultural phenomenon that for him kind of was a quintessential Oriental experience. So what's interesting about Fortuney and about American artists whom he influenced was that he was himself creating imagery, and imagery that became stereotyped. So it's the image of the sort of fanatic Arab or the fanatic Muslim, which then was picked up by an American artist named Edwin Lord Weeks. And we're going to go look at one of his paintings right here. And I'm going to go around this side.
Okay.
Another painting actually lent to the exhibition by the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore. So it's one of my favorites. Edwin Lord Weeks was a Bostonian, a very proper Bostonian. And actually many of the American artists who spent time in Europe turned out to be proper New England men. And they all seem to have wanderlust. And Weeks had particular wanderlust. He spent a great deal of time traveling throughout Europe, throughout North Africa and Egypt, throughout the Holy Land, through Syria, through Iran, and he spent a great deal of time in India. He also spent a little bit of time in Spain, sometime in the late 1870s and early 1880s. And he was actually based for a while in Granada and visited and was said even to have worked in the studio in Granada belonging to Marianna Fortuney, who had died a few years earlier. But from Granada, Weeks made a trip to Cordoba, which is within easy travel distance of Granada, especially today. If you travel to Andalusia today, you definitely from Granada will go to Cordoba or vice versa. What particularly attracted Weeks, as it did many artists, was the Great Mosque of Cordoba, a building built that began to be built in the late 8th century, expanded several times through the 10th and early 11th century. And here Weeks has shown us a view of the interior of the mosque with a very faithful representation of an arch in the wall that in the wall that faces Mecca, which is the direction in which Muslims pray 5 times a day. So this niche in the wall is covered with beautiful mosaics and inscriptions from the Quran in gold and, and blue. Weeks in front of the Quran, in front of the mihrab, has placed a group of people, a totally fictitious scene, including an old man raising a flag, and according to an account written in 1905, which is 3 years after Weeks died, this is an old man who's exhorting the faithful to rise up and expel the Christians from Cordoba. Such a thing never happened. This is not an actual event. This is a narrative that Weeks created to make a dramatic scene, to make a dramatic picture, and including in it armed soldiers. Never would you ever have an armed soldier, an armed anybody inside a place of worship like a mosque. He did a very faithful, as I said, very faithful depiction of the mihrab and its decoration, a very faithful depiction of the polylobed arches that are at right angles to the mihrab. But he made his own additions, really interesting additions to this space, including the lamp, this pierced metal lamp that you see hanging more or less in the middle of the scene. There was never such a lamp hanging in the Mosque of Cordoba, but in fact, the lamp, the upper part of the lamp, the conical shape, and the spheres above it, was the lamp that hung in the Mosque of the Alhambra in Granada, which taken from the Alhambra and in the early 16th century, it went to North Africa it was hung in a mosque in Algeria. It was brought back to Spain. It was installed in the Archaeology Museum in Madrid, and it was reproduced twice, once in a very scholarly publication of 1873, and the second time in a pocket travel book called The Industrial Arts of Spain in English, exactly the kind of book that Weeks, this artist, would have had or would have consulted in preparation for his trip or during his trip. So Weeks actually copied this lamp fixture and transposed it into his painting. He also used it in 2 other paintings, including one of a scene in India. And funnily enough, to kind of bring America back to Andalusia, a Spanish artist of the same, a contemporary of Weeks, named Gonzalez, used the same lamp, copied the same image of the lamp, and used it in one of his paintings of the interior of the Alhambra. So that's the way things kind of, I don't know, what goes around comes around, or something along those lines. So there's much detail here that merits very close attention. So if you have a chance to come back, please take a closer look at this painting. So
now we're going to go
to
Granada.
Now we're going back to Granada.
We switched the,
Okay.
we're gonna come over here with those, we were looking at it. Yes. We're back we're still in Andalusia. We've gone a little southeast from Cordoba to Granada. And Granada is, for American painters in the 19th century, it's really the ground zero of the picturesque. Granada was the last Muslim or Moorish city to be, quote, conquered by the Christians. It lasted until 1492, which was a momentous year in Spanish history. On January 6th, Granada was conquered by the Ferdinand and Isabel with Columbus looking on. 3 months later, after the kind of unifying the peninsula under the banner of Christianity, the Ferdinand and Isabel ordered the expulsion of the Jews on March 31st from the Spanish peninsula. And 3 months later, a man named Christopher Columbus sailed across the ocean sea for the first time to, quote, discover America. So Granada was the place that, in a sense, represents Moorish Spain. And what you're looking at here is a painting by Samuel Coleman, who's one of the first American artists to begin to kind of see if he could capture the spirit of old Spain, this picturesque Spain. And he's from Maine. He was the son of a bookseller. He travels to Spain in the early 1860s. He was not the first American painter to depict Spain. Others had done so before, but his canvases were extremely well known, and they sold very, very quickly. And here you see he's depicting the river that runs through the center of the city. It's now covered over, unfortunately, called the Darro. He has these picturesque types, washerwomen by the side. You don't see that too much in America in the 1860s anymore. And then he has these kind of crumbling old houses. Ruins in the 19th century are by definition picturesque. Anything having to do with Granada or Moorish Spain is by definition picturesque. And in a sense, he's trying to capture the flavor of this touristic site that Americans then wanted to buy pictures like this. And those who couldn't necessarily travel to Granada themselves, they could bring a little of Andalusia, a bit of Granada into their own homes if they could afford pictures by Samuel Coleman. But we're going to now travel a little further north. We're going to go south in this gallery, but we're going to cross over to a very well-known picture, and it has the title I love the most of all the paintings here. It is called Sunny Spain. It's by a very famous late 19th century artist, William Merritt Chase, who was born in Indiana, but spent most of his life in New York City. He was trained in Munich, became an important art teacher in New York City, first travels to Spain in 1881, where he copies, he goes to the Prado, and he fell in love with Velázquez, the great 17th century Spanish painter. He called it the best painter, the great genius, and he wanted to master Velázquez's technique. And he comes back in 1882 with some artist friends, some of whom are depicted or have paintings in his collection, and he travels out of Madrid, away from the Prado. Here he goes to Toledo, which is about 40 miles to the south of Madrid, and he depicts, once again, these kind of stereotypical images of the picturesque. A man with donkeys, of a kind you wouldn't find so much in New York City in the 1860s. A wine shop, you can just see vinos represented here, or this little shed covered with rags, and these wrought iron lamps, and a crucifix on the wall of a crumbling monastery. Ruins, sun, kind of indolence, quiet, intimacy. This is the Spain that these artists like Chase and many others sought to capture in street scenes, in scenes of courtyards, or on the banks of the Darro River. This is quintessentially the sunny Spain that Americans wanted to visit, and they did. By the 1880s, hundreds, maybe into the thousands of Americans, those with the money, who had the money to be able to travel to Europe, were beginning to put Spain on their itinerary. Travel books, travel guides of the kind Shreve mentioned before, were published by the scores. It says Spain in the 1880s, as it had never been before, it was part of the grand tour for Americans. And fortunately, thanks to the railroad, which is beginning to find its way into Spain, you could travel to Granada with relative ease by the 1880s in a way that you could not do so before. And the Americans showed up, and you can see their names many of them sign their names in the visitor registers of the Alhambra. So if any of you, and those registers are online, so you can see if you're one of your ancestors or your great uncle or your great grandfather ever visited the Alhambra, and since perhaps you can follow in his or her footsteps. So let's move on now to another stage of Romantic Spain.
A moment ago, I referred to the American artists in Spain who were captivated by and recorded their impressions of Spain's culture and Spanish monuments. I referred to them as New England men. But in fact, quite a number of the artists in this exhibition were women. And one of the most famous, the best known, is Mary Cassatt. Mary Cassatt from Pennsylvania, who lived in Philadelphia, but traveled to France to study painting, as did Edwin Lord Weeks, whose work we just looked at a moment ago. And then Cassatt had long been enthralled with the idea of Spain, and the idea of Spain of the kind that was cultivated and encouraged by Washington Irving. So Cassatt eventually went to Spain in January of 1873 and lived for 4 months in Seville, a wonderful town in Andalusia, and there painted a number of works, including these two paintings in which she captured perhaps one of the most iconic images that Americans had of Spain, which was the bullfight, and especially bullfighters, matadors. So this wonderful image of a matador wearing his traje de luces, his fancy, flashy bullfighting outfit, and his special woolen hat, the montero, which has little knobs on it that... Fur. My husband's always correcting me. It's a fur hat, not a wool hat. But it has little, decorations on it that make it look like the horns of the bull. Thank you, Richard, the horns of the bull. So here is a matador captured in a relaxed moment of lighting his cigarette. Let's just assume it's after the bullfight and he's succeeded in conquering the bull, or maybe it's before and he's relaxing with a cigarette before he goes into the ring. But then afterwards, in this other painting by Mary Cassatt, is definitely after the matador has been successful in the ring, and he's being offered a drink by this young woman, and he's dipping into it a kind of almost like a honeycomb called a panal, dipping it into the water to sweeten the water with this honey confection. And here, whereas in the first painting the matador is singular and by himself, here it's clearly a moment of connection with the young woman who, as you note, has her hand on her hip in this kind of come hither gesture. There's clearly a rapport that possibly the young woman and the matador himself want to establish. This is what happens next in the story, and I think Cassatt deliberately here in both paintings, and especially in this one, wanted us to create our own stories, to imagine what's going to happen after the matador has his refreshment and either goes off with his buddies or something else happens. In any case, this is creating really, Cassatt was kind of quite masterful, if I can put it this way, in this respect of creating sort of visual tension, creating an internal story, and at the same time, the way she depicts these figures, absolutely subscribing to and furthering the stereotyped image of Spaniards, and especially those who were involved with the the sport, the cultural phenomenon of bullfighting. So,
I have one more note. The shawl, the Spanish shawl. It's called. They were originally from Manila, from the Philippines, and by the 1910s and the 1920s, no woman in any fancy ball in New York City, Chicago, and I imagine Milwaukee as well, would show up without a Spanish shawl. It was the accessory of the moment, along with something called Carmen cigarettes and Carmen face powder and the like. It was the moment of the kind of the peak of the so-called Spanish craze. And I love the fact that she's wearing it, and in a sense, she's anticipating Mary Cassatt here is anticipating a fashion craze that would take place within 30 years. But if Shreve mentioned the torero or the matador as the stereotypical image of Spain in the 19th century, we're going to go to see another image of stereotypical Spain, that is the flamenco dancer. Flamenco had been popular, occasional visiting dancers from Western Europe. I thought we were going to start with him, with Sargent here. This woman, Carmen Moreno Docet, she's 22 years old. She was she had also known as the Pearl of Seville. She first came to everyone's attention at the World Exhibition in Paris in 1889, where she danced. And the painter of this image, John Singer Sargent, who was perhaps one of the more famous artists, American artists who went to Spain in the late 19th century, saw her dance. In the early 1890s, she's performing in a kind of a slightly tawdry music hall in New York. Sargent goes to see her. She's a great hit. Everybody likes this kind of sexy flamenco dancing, the kind of moves. They hadn't seen that before on a massive scale. She's so popular that a number of artists begin to invite her into their homes for private parties. And one of them was Carol Beckworth, and Sargent paints her there, and he sees her there and asks her to pose for her. And she, once again, with this kind of magnificent kind of yellow dress, rather stiff, but once again, with the bravura of the elbow, saying, "Don't mess with me, boys, or if you're going to mess with me, you better be prepared to reward me handsomely." And she has that slightly come hither look. But just after, as Sargent is painting her, he asked his friend, William Merritt Chase, who you've seen before, said, "Would you have a big party in your 10th Street studio and have her dance, and I'll get the famous Boston collector, Isabella Stewart Gardner, to pay for the whole thing." And so they have a party on April the 1st, 1890, in the studio of William Merritt Chase. Gardner is there, other society leaders are there, Stanford White, the great New York architect, is there, August St. Gaudens, the famous sculptor, is there, and the women who were there didn't like the way that she was dancing. They found it somewhat scandalous, but the boys were enchanted, and they were so enchanted and it was captured by Chase. They threw gold bracelets and flowers at her feet. The party started at 12 o'clock. The women at one point walked out. It's very interesting. And as one of the participants said, it did not go well, the party. This painting by Chase, which captures more of the movement of La Carmencita, sold instantly. And it wound up in the collection of a famous American who lived in Montreal, and then who bequeathed it to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 1906. But in contrast, the Sargent, which in many ways you might say is a bit more, she's more statuesque. It was much more famous in its own day. It was featured, a reproduction of it was featured on the cover of Harper's Monthly. It was on display in New York for a couple of months. It was brought to Chicago. He wanted somebody to sell it. He wanted to buy it. He wanted Isabella Stewart Gardner to buy it. She said, I won't have anything to do with that woman. He then took it to London, put it on display. Some people said it was hideous. That ugly yellow dress she's wearing it, and this grotesque woman. And other people said, this is the most artistic picture we've ever seen. Didn't sell. 2 years later, he takes it to Paris, finally puts it on display. The French government buys it, and it's now hanging permanently in the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. And it's a wonderful loan to have these two Carmencitas. And it's really Brandon Ruud and his whole team that's been able to bring together these two images of Carmencita now dancing for you in Milwaukee. One more thing, I forgot to mention it. The Alhambra Theater. The Alhambra is kind of as a place that can transport you in time and space. There was an Alhambra Theater here in Milwaukee on West Wisconsin Avenue that was built in about 1896, if I'm not mistaken, and unfortunately it was torn down in 1943. The Alhambra Theater was once again one of these great atmospheric movie palaces, and it was called the Alhambra. Others were called the Granada because, like the Alhambra itself, it would transport you in time and place out of your own humdrum world into a fantasy world, much as the Americans who visited the Alhambra monument in the 19th century were transported through time and through space to another era. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard and Shreve. And I think that we have time for a brief conversation.
Do we? Oh, good.
Sure, absolutely.
Did we go on too long? No.
No.
I just remembered. This right?
Yeah, please.
Thank you. Thank you, thank you.
Oh, thank you. I'm going to remove my mask now.
And may we do the same?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yes.
That was great. Thank you so much for providing some context and insights into those wonderful and marvelous details. And of course, it inspired, for me, any number of questions. But I wanted to start this with one for both of you. Since you alluded to it in your talk and your discussions, but of course it's also been much a topic of your writing, and that was about collecting and patronage. And I kind of wanted to start, since we're in this gallery, actually with the El Greco on this wall, an artist you, of course, Richard, have written much about. And you've talked about the interest by various artists in Spanish painters over the course of time, chased with Velázquez, or anything like that. What at the turn of the century interested collectors in El Greco at that particular moment?
Thank you. It's interesting. Except for Murillo, who was one of the first pictures in paintings in the exhibition, he was the only really Spanish painter, Spanish Old Master painter that American collectors were interested in much before the 1880s. Velázquez came into fashion in the 1880s, thanks to the artists in the exhibition. In the sense, they popularized his art, and collectors began to collect, if they could, Velázquez's. But El Greco was not in the picture. He was too. They found him a bit odd. No one appreciated the art of El Greco until about the 1880s, when artists like Degas and Manet and some French avant-garde artists and impressionists said, this is a very interesting man because he didn't paint in the academic fashion. He was free form. He was an artist unto his own, true to his own aesthetics. And starting in the late 1890s, there was a growing interest in him. Marianna Cassatt began to develop an interest in El Greco through her friends in Paris. Marianna Cassatt introduced El Greco to important New York collectors, Louisine and Harry Havermeyer, and William Merritt Chase persuaded, who was seen El Greco in Spain, persuaded the Philadelphia Museum of Art to purchase an El Greco. It was the first museum in America ever to buy an El Greco. That took place in 1900. But from that point on, boom, it was the Atlantic, I should say the El Greco gold rush was on. Wealthy collectors across the United States were interested in getting an El Greco, and even collectors like who's the guy, the Duncan Phillips in Washington, or Barnes in Philadelphia. They were really interested in 20th century modern art. They always bought an El Greco because he was somehow he was a precursor. He was a modern before the moderns, and it was de rigueur to add an El Greco to your collection. And it's very interesting that you still find collectors today. That gentleman in Baltimore we met just a few years ago collected Russian constructivist pictures. He wanted an El Greco and he found one. He actually sold some important Russian paintings to put one in his house. So in a sense, that fascination with El Greco, it began in the early 20th century, and in the sense that it marks the rediscovery of a forgotten master. Is a very interesting phenomenon in the history of art, and perhaps Shreve has something to add to that.
Well, I had a specific question for you, Shreve, and that was in regard to Fortuney.
Yes.
Since you had talked about Fortuney, and he was so important and so popular in the 19th century with both artists and collectors. William Merritt Chase, and I paraphrase here, was considered the reincarnation of Fortuney. American collectors, of course, scrambled to get their hands on his paintings, add them to his collection. What was it specifically about Fortuney that interested them?
I think that Fortuney had the double advantage of being Spanish. So by definition, not just foreign, but sort of exotically foreign, and was able to capture the exoticism and fantasy of of Spain's Moorish past, and of the equally alluring world of North Africa, and especially the North African Moorish history. So, and that combined with his incredible bravura, stylistic bravura, the way when we look at the painting of Arab Fantasia in the exhibition, and you see the way he actually handled paint, there's something very tactile about it, very textured, very strong and powerful, like he's attacking the canvas with his brush and his pigments. And all of those characteristics, his own Spanish, well, actually, as I said earlier, he's Catalan, which means he's from the region around Barcelona, but probably for American collectors, there wasn't much difference between somebody from Catalonia and somebody from Castile. But his Spanishness, his ability to capture and invoke the imagery of the Moorish past and of North African exoticism, and his incredible handling of paint are all features that combine to make him a favorite among American collectors like Henry Walters in Baltimore, who made a point of buying paintings by Fortuney.
Well, thank you very much. And in that vein, also a question for both of you, because you discussed this evening, you have also both written about the American fascination with Islamic Spain, whether starting with Irving, Granada, the Alhambra, extending to Weeks and the mosque in Cordoba. What do you contribute that to? Does it fluctuate over time? Is it a kind of a sign, a symbol of that interest in the picturesque, as you were discussing, the romanticism? What are some of the features of that, and what do you contribute that interest to?
Shreve, why don't you start?
Well, I think part of it, and here I'm not going to agree completely, but I'm going to follow a little bit along the line developed by a scholar named Edward Said, who wrote a book called Orientalism, who argued that basically this was all about Americans feeling, the American feeling and need to feel superior to other cultures, and particularly to those other cultures in that funny part of the world that nobody really cared about or knew too much about, which of course wasn't actually true, but that was the perception was that to be evoking the Orient, to paint paintings called Orientalist, or to be an artist like Edwin Lord Weeks was known as the greatest American Orientalist painter. This was a way of projecting and asserting your cultural superiority and the superiority of the country from which you, the artist, came, that is the United States of America, even though America didn't have colonial interest in the quote unquote Orient as it was, let's say, embracing North Africa and a little further east, but it still was a way of projecting imperial superiority and identity. But Richard, as a historian, may have some other thoughts about this.
Sure I do, but I'm not so sure for individuals such as Irving, the political aspects of Orientalism as explained by Said is not part of it. It was a totally romanticized picture. And the Alhambra became itself the mark of a kind of a pleasure palace, sort of like Coleridge's Xanadu. It was a place you could enjoy life as it was the 1,001 nights that you could somehow live in. And if you went to a theater called the Alhambra or a casino called the Alhambra, you would be transported. And starting in the 1860s, from the Midwest to the east and to the west, you have neo-Moorish buildings being constructed, not only in the United States, but also in Western Europe, and also rediscovering the Moorish past in Spain itself. So you have the Granada Casino in New York City, or if you go to Santa Fe, jumping to early 20th century, there's the Shriner Temple in Santa Fe is built in the neo-Moorish style that meant to evoke the Alhambra in the middle of a so-called Spanish Santa Fe, in the sense, and then there, even in California, they called mission style in the 1890s, which is that new style of kind of neo-colonial architecture. It was a mixture of Moorish and Mexican. In a sense, there was something comforting about it. It evoked the past. Or if you went to Florida, in the 1890s, when they started building these neo-Moorish hotels in St. Augustine or Tampa or in Miami, or I could even jump to New York, where they built replicas of the famous minaret called the Giralda, built by Stanford White in 1888. There were 25 or about 20 replicas of the Giralda in the United States, and the closest one to Milwaukee is in the facade of I'm going to forget the name, the Hearst building, the Hearst Tower building, right overlooking the Chicago River. It's kind of a bas-relief facade, Giralda erected right into the facade. There's another one in Cleveland, and there was one in Miami as well. In a sense, it was part of this rediscovery and tried to capture a little bit of Spain, Moorish and otherwise, and bring it to the United States. It evoked luxury, relaxation, pleasure, gambling, who knows?
I love that. Well, thank you. And in that vein, I have one kind of final question, and that is also, you've written quite a bit and even mentioned some of these authors, most notably, of course, because we can see him visually here, Washington Irving, travel books, guidebooks, you referenced them, Shreve. And you've also written that in the first half of the 19th century, there were actually very few American visitors who came to Spain. And then by 1920, there were 40,000 a year, just exploded. What what do you attribute that to by mid-19th century, this great increase and then this huge explosion by the early 20th century?
Well, I think there's two. One, political stability in Spain starting in the 1870s, 1880s helped enormously. It was a place, the brigands were gone. The brigands were never that many, but they by the 1880s, they were gone. And then on this side of the Atlantic, it was the Gilded Age. There was more money, more Americans had money to travel. And there was a kind of a cosmopolitan moment where wealthy Americans, or those with money to travel, instead of just bringing foreign bric-a-brac into their own houses, they wanted to experience those countries abroad. And all of a sudden, Spain is on the itinerary in the 1880s because it was accessible. There were trains, direct trains from Paris to Madrid now, or you could go by steamer starting in the 1880s and 1890s. But beyond that, because Spain, compared to Northern Europe, was, quote, backwards. It was not quite as industrialized. You still could find muleteers and water carriers in the streets, and sometimes men and women in traditional dress. It evoked that pre-industrial era, that bygone era that was kind of lost in the hustle and bustle of industrializing American cities. In a sense, it was the world we have lost. And it was, and individuals in Britain like John Ruskin or Henry Adams. Henry Adams had found his world we have lost in Mont Saint-Michel, off the coast of Brittany in northern France. But for Sargent, or Archer Milton Huntington, the great New York collector, or Charles Deering in Chicago, that world we have lost was really located for many in Spain. And Deering went so far as to build himself, or first he built and then he bought a castle in Spain and filled it with Spanish art, starting around 1910. In a sense, he was the character. He wanted to live that Spanish experience, go back to a bygone age that he didn't find in the hustle and bustle and the smoke of Chicago of the 1890s and 1910s.
Excellent, thank you. Any additional or final thoughts from either one of you?
Let me just add on to what Richard said. I think there's another factor here, which has to do with the development, the opening of public museums in North America in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So the museums were open to the public, and the museums began to be filled with works of art being donated by collectors like Deering, Havemeyer, and so forth. And don't quote me on the specific chronology here, but so there were works of art like the ones in this exhibition that the public started coming to see. And some of that public was the public that was able then to buy the transatlantic tickets and to plan their trips from France to southern Spain to enjoy the wonderful warm weather that they saw depicted in the paintings, for instance, to admire, but also to be somewhat perplexed by perhaps the quaint customs, the picturesque customs that were depicted in the paintings that were on the walls of their museums. So I think there's another element here that has to do with the whole history of museum development, public museums in the United States.
No, absolutely agreed. Well, again, I want to thank you both very much for being here this evening, for offering such great insights. This has been absolutely fantastic. And I want to thank everyone out there for also joining us this evening. And I look forward to seeing you again. So thank you, everyone. Take care. Now our masks back on, I guess.
All right. Thank you all.
Thank you.